In 1945, Britain had a problem, a very strange problem. They had too many trucks, not just a few extra vehicles sitting around in some depot somewhere. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of American-made trucks scattered across Britain, Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Trucks that had helped win the war. Trucks that had carried soldiers, ammunition, food, fuel, and everything else an army needs to keep fighting. And now the war was over, and nobody knew what to do with them. What happened next is one of the strangest stories of the post-war period. Some of these trucks were sold for pennies. Some were deliberately destroyed. Some were pushed off cliffs into the ocean. And some simply vanished, only appeared decades later in the most unexpected places on Earth. This is the story of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks and what really happened to them after World War II. But before we get to the end of this story, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to 1940, when Britain was alone, desperate, and running out of everything. After the fall of France in June 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The situation was desperate in ways that are hard to fully appreciate today. The British Army had just been evacuated from Dunkirk, and while the rescue of over 300,000 soldiers was a miracle, they had left almost all their equipment behind on the beaches of France. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, weapons, all of it abandoned. Britain's factories were working around the clock to replace what had been lost, but they couldn't keep up. The country was producing Spitfires and Hurricanes to fight off the Luftwaffe, but that meant fewer resources for everything else. And one of the things Britain desperately needed was trucks. You might not think of trucks as glamorous weapons of war. They don't have the drama of tanks or fighter planes. Nobody makes movies about trucks. But here's the truth that every military commander understands. An army runs on logistics. You can have the best soldiers, the best weapons, and the best strategy in the world. But if you can't move food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to where they need to be, you're going to lose. Trucks are the backbone of modern warfare. Without them, everything stops. In 1940, Britain didn't have enough trucks. Not even close. British factories were producing military vehicles, but nowhere near the numbers needed for a global war. The situation was becoming critical. And then America stepped in with one of the most important programs of the entire war. Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease Act was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in March 1941, 9 months before America officially entered the war. The idea was simple but revolutionary. America would lend war materials to countries fighting against the Axis powers, with the understanding that they would be returned or paid for after the war. In practice, this meant America became the arsenal of democracy, pumping out weapons, vehicles, aircraft, ships, and supplies for Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other allied nations. It was the largest transfer of military equipment in human history. For Britain, Lend-Lease was a lifeline, and among the most important items flowing across the Atlantic were trucks, American trucks. Thousands of them at first, then tens of thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands. These weren't British designs built in American factories. These were American trucks, designed for American roads, adapted for military use, and shipped across the ocean to fight a war on the other side of the world. The numbers are staggering when you really look at them. During the course of the war, Britain received approximately 400,000 trucks and vehicles through the Lend-Lease program. 400,000. To put that in perspective, if you lined up all those trucks bumper to bumper, the line would stretch for over 2,000 miles. That's roughly the distance from London to Moscow. Every single one of those vehicles had to be manufactured in American factories, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean through waters infested with German U-boats, unloaded at British ports, and distributed to military units across multiple continents. It was a logistical achievement that defies imagination. So what kinds of trucks are we talking about? The Lend-Lease program sent Britain a wide variety of American vehicles, but a few models became iconic symbols of the Allied war effort. The first and perhaps most famous was the Studebaker US-6. This 2.5-ton truck became the workhorse of Allied logistics. It was reliable, tough, and could handle almost any terrain. The Studebaker had a 6-cylinder Hercules engine that just kept running no matter what you threw at it. British drivers loved these trucks because they were so much more powerful and reliable than anything they had used before. The US-6 could carry 2.5 tons of cargo on roads, but in practice, drivers often loaded them with much more. These trucks hauled ammunition to the front lines, carried wounded soldiers to field hospitals, transported food and water to troops in the desert, and did 1,000 other jobs that kept the Allied war machine moving. Then there was the GMC another 2.5-ton truck that became legendary for its durability. American soldiers called it the Jimmy, or the Deuce and a Half, and British forces adopted these nicknames too. The GMC was everywhere during the war. It had a distinctive look with its rounded hood and canvas-covered cargo bed, and it became one of the most recognizable vehicles of the entire conflict. Over 560,000 GMC CKWs were produced during the war, making it one of the most produced military vehicles in history. The Dodge WC series was another American truck that became essential to British operations. These were lighter vehicles, typically 0.75-ton or 1.5-ton capacity, used for reconnaissance, communications, and transporting personnel. The Dodge became famous for its versatility. It could be configured as a weapons carrier, an ambulance, a command vehicle, or a dozen other specialized roles. British forces used thousands of these Dodges across every theater of the war. And of course, there was the Jeep. The Willys MB and Ford GPW, collectively known as Jeeps, were technically not trucks, but they were such an important part of the Lend-Lease program that they deserve mention. Britain received over 100,000 Jeeps during the war, and these little vehicles became ubiquitous. Every general seemed to have one. Every reconnaissance unit depended on them. The Jeep could go anywhere and do almost anything, and British soldiers came to love them as much as American soldiers did. These American vehicles transformed British military capabilities. Before Lend-Lease, British forces were using a hodgepodge of civilian vehicles pressed into military service, aging trucks from the previous war, and whatever domestic production could provide. The American trucks were newer, more powerful, more standardized, and available in quantities that British factories could never match. A British armored division in 1944 might have hundreds of American trucks in its supply train, all running on the same parts, using the same fuel, requiring the same maintenance procedures. This standardization made logistics infinitely easier. Now let me tell you about how these trucks were actually used during the war, because the stories are incredible. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces were fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps across thousands of miles of desert. The distances involved were enormous. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles across terrain where a breakdown could mean death. Lend-Lease trucks became the lifeline of the 8th Army. Convoys of Studebakers and GMCs would drive through the night to avoid the brutal desert heat, delivering water, fuel, ammunition, and food to units at the front. The trucks kicked up enormous clouds of dust that could be seen for miles, making them targets for Luftwaffe aircraft. Drivers learned to space their vehicles far apart to minimize losses from air attacks. Many trucks were lost, but many more got through. Without these American vehicles, the British victory at El Alamein in 1942 might never have happened. In Italy, the terrain was completely different, but equally challenging. Instead of flat desert, Allied forces faced mountains, narrow roads, and rivers that flooded every time it rained. American trucks proved their worth again and again, climbing grades that would have stopped lesser vehicles, fording streams, and somehow keeping supplies flowing to troops fighting their way up the Italian peninsula. The famous Red Ball Express that kept the Allied advance going after D-Day gets most of the attention, but British supply operations in Italy were equally impressive and relied just as heavily on Lend-Lease trucks. And then there was the campaign in Northwest Europe after D-Day. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 was the largest amphibious operation in history, and it required a logistical effort to match. As Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, their supply lines grew longer and longer. By the time Paris was liberated in August 1944, supplies were being trucked from the Normandy beaches hundreds of miles to the front lines. British forces were advancing alongside American forces, and both depended absolutely on American trucks to keep moving. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every can of food had to come from the beaches on the back of a truck. Without Lend-Lease, the British contribution to the liberation of Europe would have been impossible. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. All those trucks, all that equipment, all those vehicles that had been so desperately needed for so long, what happens when you don't need them anymore? On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. 3 months later, Japan surrendered too, and World War II was finally finished. Soldiers began dreaming of going home, and military planners began facing a logistical nightmare of a completely different kind. What do you do with all the stuff? The scale of the problem was almost incomprehensible. Britain had hundreds of thousands of American vehicles scattered across multiple continents. Trucks in Germany, trucks in Italy, trucks in North Africa, trucks in the Middle East, trucks in India, trucks in Southeast Asia. Many of these vehicles were worn out from years of hard use. Others were still in good condition. All of them represented a problem that needed to be solved. The first issue was legal. Under the terms of Lend-Lease, the equipment was technically on loan. Britain was supposed to either return it or pay for it. But returning hundreds of thousands of trucks to America made no sense. The shipping costs alone would be astronomical. American factories had already shifted back to civilian production, and the last thing the American market needed was a flood of used military trucks. So the two governments had to negotiate what would happen to all this equipment. The solution they came up with was pragmatic but strange. For equipment that was returned or destroyed, Britain owed nothing. For equipment that was kept and used for civilian purposes, Britain would have to pay, but at a steep discount from the original value. The negotiations went on for years, but the basic framework meant that Britain had several options for dealing with their surplus trucks. Send them back, destroy them, or keep them and pay a fraction of what they were worth. Sending them back made no economic sense, so that option was mostly ignored. That left destruction or retention, and both of those paths led to some fascinating outcomes. Let's start with destruction, because this is where the story gets really strange. In the years immediately after the war, thousands of perfectly functional American trucks were deliberately destroyed. Not because they were broken, not because they were worn out, but because destroying them was cheaper than any alternative. The logic went like this. Storing trucks costs money. Maintaining trucks so they don't deteriorate costs money. Shipping trucks anywhere costs money. But driving a truck off a cliff into the ocean? That's free. And that's exactly what happened. Across Britain and its territories, military vehicles were disposed of in ways that would make any collector today weep. Trucks were driven to the edges of quarries and pushed over. They were dumped into the sea from piers and cliffs. They were stripped of usable parts and then burned. They were buried in mass graves, literally bulldozed into pits and covered with earth. In some locations, local civilians could hear the sounds of vehicles being destroyed around the clock for days on end. One of the most notorious disposal sites was in the waters around Malta. The small Mediterranean island had been a crucial British base during the war, and it was home to thousands of military vehicles when the fighting stopped. Rather than ship these vehicles anywhere, British authorities simply drove them into the sea. Today, divers exploring the waters around Malta can still find trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles sitting on the ocean floor, preserved by the salt water in an eerie underwater graveyard of military equipment. Similar scenes played out in other locations. In North Africa, vehicles were abandoned in the desert, left to be slowly buried by sand and claimed by rust. In Europe, trucks were sold for scrap at prices so low they were essentially being given away. In Asia, vehicles were dumped, burned, or simply left behind when British forces withdrew. The waste was extraordinary. Vehicles that had crossed the Atlantic through submarine-infested waters, that had carried supplies across deserts and over mountains, that had helped win the war. These same vehicles were being deliberately destroyed because no one could figure out what else to do with them. But not all the trucks met this fate. Many thousands were sold, given away, or otherwise distributed into civilian hands. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because these trucks went everywhere and did everything. In Britain itself, surplus military trucks became the foundation of the post-war transportation industry. The country's infrastructure had been devastated by bombing, and its economy was in shambles. New vehicles were expensive and hard to get, but surplus military trucks? Those were cheap and abundant. Farmers bought them to haul crops and livestock. Construction companies used them to rebuild bombed cities. Delivery services pressed them into use, carrying goods around the country. The distinctive shapes of American military trucks became a common sight on British roads throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Some entrepreneurs made fortunes buying surplus vehicles at auction and reselling them. The British government would sell trucks for absurdly low prices, sometimes just a few pounds each. And clever businessmen would buy them in bulk, make minor repairs, and sell them to farmers, builders, and anyone else who needed cheap transportation. These surplus trucks helped kickstart the British economy at a time when every pound mattered. The trucks went even further abroad. British colonies and former colonies around the world received shipments of surplus vehicles. In Africa, Lend-Lease trucks became common on roads from Cairo to Cape Town. In the Middle East, Studebakers and GMCs could be found hauling goods through markets that had seen camels and donkeys just a few years before. In Asia, the trucks helped rebuild countries devastated by Japanese occupation. Everywhere the British Empire had influence, American trucks followed. Some of these vehicles had remarkably long service lives. In developing countries where new vehicles were expensive and spare parts scarce, communities became expert at keeping old military trucks running. Local mechanics learned every quirk of the Studebaker US-6, every weakness of the GMC CCKW. They fabricated replacement parts from scrap metal. They converted trucks to run on whatever fuel was available. They kept vehicles going for decades through sheer ingenuity and determination. There are documented cases of Lend-Lease trucks still in service in the 1990s, 50 years after the war ended. In remote parts of Africa and Asia, these American trucks from the 1940s were still hauling goods and people along dusty roads, maintained by mechanics who had learned their trade from their fathers and grandfathers. The trucks had become family heirlooms, passed down through generations, worth more as working vehicles than they would ever be as collector's items. The Soviet Union received even more Lend-Lease trucks than Britain, and the story of what happened to Soviet trucks after the war is equally fascinating. The USSR received approximately 400,000 American trucks through Lend-Lease, and these vehicles became absolutely essential to the Soviet war effort. The famous Soviet advances of 1944 and 1945, when the Red Army drove the Germans back across Eastern Europe and into Berlin, were made possible in large part by American trucks carrying Soviet supplies. After the war, many of these trucks remained in Soviet service for decades. The Studebaker US-6 was so popular in the USSR that Soviet factories began producing their own version, the ZYS-151, which was essentially a copy of the American design. Lend-Lease trucks shaped Soviet vehicle design for a generation. But let's get back to Britain and talk about some specific vehicles and what happened to them, because individual stories can be more compelling than statistics. Consider the Studebaker US-6 with serial number 6854321. I'm making up that specific number, but trucks like this one were real. This particular Studebaker might have rolled off the assembly line in South Bend, Indiana, in early 1943. It would have been driven onto a ship, crossed the Atlantic while sailors watched nervously for U-boat periscopes, and arrived at a British port. From there, it might have been assigned to a supply unit supporting the 8th Army in North Africa. It would have driven thousands of miles across the desert, survived strafing attacks from German aircraft, and carried countless tons of ammunition and supplies to the front. After North Africa, it might have been shipped to Italy, where it climbed mountain roads and forded swollen rivers. Then on to France after D-Day, where it joined the endless convoys pushing supplies toward the front. By 1945, this hypothetical Studebaker would have been worn out. Its engine would be tired, its suspension shot, its tires worn thin. And then the war ended. What happened to it? Maybe it was one of the trucks driven into the sea, or maybe it was sold at auction for 10 pounds to a farmer who needed something to haul hay. If it was sold, it might have worked on that farm for another 20 years, slowly rusting in the English rain until it finally gave up and was left in a barn to decay. Or maybe, just maybe, it was rediscovered in that barn decades later by a collector who recognized what it was and spent years restoring it to its former glory. Today, that same truck might be on display at a military vehicle show, polished and pristine, a survivor of a war that ended almost 80 years ago. That's the arc of many of these vehicles: war, neglect, decay, and sometimes resurrection. Today, surviving Lend-Lease trucks from World War II are highly prized by collectors. The same vehicles that were being pushed off cliffs in 1946 are now worth tens of thousands of dollars in good condition. Military vehicle collectors around the world search for surviving examples, and the rarest variants can command extraordinary prices. Museums compete to acquire good examples for their displays. Shows and rallies attract hundreds of lovingly restored military vehicles, driven by enthusiasts who have spent years and fortunes bringing these old trucks back to life. The irony is bitter. If only a fraction of the trucks that were destroyed in 1945 and 1946 had been preserved instead, there would be plenty for everyone. But in those chaotic post-war years, nobody was thinking about future collectors or historical preservation. They were thinking about how to dispose of mountains of surplus equipment as quickly and cheaply as possible. The decisions made sense at the time, but they seem almost criminal in retrospect. There are some happy endings in this story. Several Lend-Lease trucks have been recovered from the ocean floor around Malta, carefully restored, and returned to running condition. Others have been pulled from barns, fields, and jungles where they sat for decades. Every year, a few more forgotten vehicles are rediscovered and saved. But for every truck that gets rescued, hundreds more were lost forever to rust, decay, and deliberate destruction. So what's the legacy of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks? The immediate legacy was victory. Without American industrial production, without the trucks and tanks and planes that flowed across the Atlantic, Britain could not have continued fighting. The Lend-Lease program kept Britain in the war during the dark days of 1940 and 1941, and it gave Allied forces the logistical capability to take the fight to the enemy in North Africa, Italy, and France. The trucks themselves were unglamorous but essential, the workhorses that made everything else possible. The longer-term legacy is more complicated. The post-war disposal of Lend-Lease equipment shaped economies around the world. In Britain, cheap surplus trucks helped rebuild a war-torn country. In developing nations, American military vehicles provided transportation infrastructure that would otherwise have taken decades to develop. The design of these trucks influenced vehicle development in countries from the Soviet Union to Australia. And the memory of American generosity, of a country that provided war materials when they were desperately needed, helped cement the post-war alliance between the United States and Britain. The story of the trucks also raises uncomfortable questions about waste and planning. The destruction of perfectly good vehicles, because no one could figure out what else to do with them, is a reminder of how chaotic and improvised even the best-planned military operations can be. The same governments that had organized the greatest logistical effort in human history to win the war proved unable to manage the peace with the same efficiency. Trucks that had been precious just months earlier became garbage to be disposed of in whatever way was cheapest. For the collectors and historians who study these vehicles today, every surviving truck is a connection to that extraordinary period. When you see a restored Studebaker US-6 at a vehicle show, you're looking at a piece of history. That truck, or one just like it, might have carried ammunition at El Alamein, or supplies to the troops liberating France, or wounded soldiers to aid stations in Italy. It was part of the great machine that defeated fascism and saved civilization. The fact that any of them survived at all feels like a small miracle. Britain received approximately 400,000 American trucks and vehicles through Lend-Lease during World War II. These vehicles helped win the war in every theater from North Africa to Northwest Europe. When the war ended, most of them were destroyed, sold for scrap, or left to decay. A lucky few survived to be restored and preserved by collectors. Today, perhaps a few hundred remain in running condition worldwide, out of hundreds of thousands that once existed. The next time you see an old military truck at a parade or a museum, take a moment to think about its story. Think about the factory where it was built, the ocean it crossed, the battles it supported, and the strange fate that awaited it when the fighting stopped. Think about the soldier who drove it, the mechanic who maintained it, and the collector who saved it from oblivion. Every one of these trucks has a story, and together they tell the larger story of how the world fought the biggest war in human history, won that war, and then tried to figure out what to do with all the equipment that made victory possible. That's what really happened to Britain's Lend-Lease trucks after World War II. It's a story of desperation and abundance, of necessity and waste, of destruction and preservation. It's a very human story when you think about it, and it's one that deserves to be